This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional world. Reaching those goals often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging jargon free communication. If you're interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that, go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, but not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for key stakeholders. I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Sonali Majumdar to the show today. Sonali is a scientist who designs professional development programs for PhDs to help empower versatile problem solvers who create impact in diverse career sectors. After her undergraduate degree in microbiology and master's in biotechnology in Bangalore, Sonali worked as a clinical embryologist and helped set up an IVF lab in Kolkata. In 2007, she came to the US for PhD training in biochemistry and molecular biology at the University of Georgia. After earning her PhD, Sonali did her postdoc at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where she studied the role of RNA protein complexes in brain development, as well as in cancers. During her postdoc, Sonali volunteered to support career and professional development of postdocs in New York City, which laid the groundwork for her professional development work. In 2018, she joined University of Virginia to build a professional development program for PhD students and postdocs called Ph.D. with the goal of facilitating long-term success for PhDs in a range of career paths. After the successful implementation of the vision behind PhD in May 2022, Sonali moved to the Graduate School of Princeton University, where she joins the Grad Futures team as Assistant Dean for Professional Development. Sonali, welcome to the show. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me, Mark. It's really nice to talk to you as well.
Sonali, you've made several significant and successful transitions in your academic and professional journeys, as I referenced in the intro. What can you tell us about those transitions from Bangalore University in India to the University of Georgia, research scholar at Memorial Sloan Kettering to associate director, professional development at UVA, for example? What about those transitions that maybe surprised you, or perhaps in retrospect, that you wish maybe you'd known at the time in the 2020 vision of hindsight?
So, at the outset, I feel like my non-linear career path has been mostly motivated by my curiosity to learn something new and solve interesting problems, but also really embrace serendipity and follow my instincts in some ways. And so, right after my master's in Bangalore, I did not want to get into PhD right away, although my family was really intent on doing that, because I wanted some professional experience working, really thinking about what professional life looks like and not being a student for a while. And so I went into healthcare and helped set up an IVF lab. Few years later, I wanted to learn something new and thought that was a good time to re-engage with the PhD training experience and came to the United States at University of Georgia. And because I had a professional experience in a high-stake environment in the healthcare sector in India, that put a lot of perspective through my PhD training. And a lot of the challenges I faced in my research did not seem as significant as they might have if I had come after my PhD master's. And so also it really helped me think about my future profession. I thought I'd go back into either healthcare or do biotech research, and never really had any specific goals of continuing in the tenure track path. And that was consolidated through my experience in the PhD, because I really like that collaborative and designing experience that we get in biotech or healthcare. And also the public faced and focused or like even service to society, impactful work always drives me. But while I was doing my postdoc, I got introduced to another interesting challenge where I figured out by then that's when we had started getting data on the PhD career outcomes and saw that PhDs were going into a lot of diverse fields, but weren't necessarily being intentionally trained or introduced to these fields in their training, and they stumbled upon them. And I thought that was a really interesting problem to solve and create pathways that I necessarily did not have or my peers did not have in building professional development. And so to bring it all together, I've generally responded to my innate curiosities and instincts, which have led to my professional trajectory so far. But in hindsight, I learned much later that the skills that I developed during my PhD, much beyond my domain knowledge, were broadly applicable to a variety of work and that were actually more valuable than my specific area or field of study. And I wish I had focused more on communicating that from the beginning, my lived experiences as well, and also some of the strengths you bring as an international scientist into the workforce today. And on hindsight, I wish I hadn't let the circumstances that also surround you as an immigrant in the United States weigh me down as much. And I had taken more breaks between different career transitions. So, just to put it in context, I don't think I've taken any breaks since 2000, or not long, significant breaks since 2004, since I started my first job. And so even when I moved to a PhD, I took a week break before moving countries. And sometimes I just feel that should take that time, but the way that the immigration system works and you move from a visa to visa, it's very complicated to manage it.
Hmm.
And so in hindsight, I wish I'd taken more time in thinking about it. And also like I said, it's hard to all of those listeners who are listening who are international. It's hard to make transitions in professions and fields that are not directly related to your research as an international scientist, but it's doable. And I'd love to talk more about it eventually.
Yes, and I have a number of questions that I want to ask you related to those. But first, I want to just highlight and maybe ask a couple of follow-ups because you made so many wonderful points that are really important in your response to the first question. And one was following your gut instincts. And sometimes we think I'm on a certain path and I need to continue on that path, while there might be some gut feelings that maybe I should try something else or take a little bit of a break. We sometimes suppress those just because we're on that path. We need to continue going on. So thank you for highlighting the need to listen to those sort of voices inside that are counseling you to maybe consider something else. And that really leads to the curiosity point that you made. Always being curious is such an important trait for all of us to remember. And your lived experience as well, bringing that in to your whole sort of professional persona, I think is really important. Sometimes we forget about the value and the lessons that we learn going through different experiences, and we're going to talk about some in your particular case. So thank you for making those points. They're really so vital for all of us to keep in mind. You talked about the skill set, the PhD skill set, and how it applies in various environments. And I'd love for you to share with listeners your philosophy about the PhD skill set.
Yeah, I think what I talked about, just really thinking about the process of PhD and all of the different skills that we develop during the process and getting opportunities to try those in different contexts outside of your research field. And going back to what you said about curiosity, right? I always like to talk to students about how we almost turn off our scientific mind when it comes to our lives. Why are we not using the same curiosity outside of our labs? And so that's what I've done with my career path. I am innately a problem solver. And so I really like using analytical and strategic thinking, going from really designing from big picture problems to thinking about specific goals and action plans. And as reading through papers, we as PhDs learn how to really distill down data that's relevant to set up context and build a narrative and really let go of extraneous information. And that's really important in the line of work that I I'm in right now. In building and designing something, you really have to look at the big picture. What are some specific background information you need to know to set up the context and approach your problem, and how to approach it, what kind of goals you want to set, and what action plans. And the other thing that is really applicable from the PhD experience, whether you is design. We inherently learn how to design research problems or experiments to solve those problems. And that can be applied to a lot of different career paths. In my specific case, I'm applying it to building programs, thinking about whether the design itself is clunky or nimble. Can it be applied to different contexts? Looking closely at what part of it is scalable, how it might be sustained over time, what are the sources of funding and resources that we would bring. And on that point, I would like to bring the point about collaboration, which a lot of PhDs, if not majority of them in the sciences, are constantly building to support their research. And the same thing happens in my line of work now, where I'm building collaborations more like an ecosystem of support for professional development of PhDs. It takes a village to do that. And so I really rely on some of the communication and collaboration skills I built as part of my PhD to connect with constituents and folks from a lot of different backgrounds on our mission and how they could be helpful in really upholding that mission. And I go back to that whole growth mindset and willingness to continually learn, which I think motivates most PhDs to get into new fields. And that is applicable, especially now in the future of work when things are changing so much. And so applying that curiosity to constantly learn into your professional life is also going to be really helpful. And finally, the biggest asset of the PhD is really getting to meet people from all over the world who come from very different backgrounds and prior experience. And you get to really expand your outlook and perspective by working and getting to know people from these backgrounds. And also, like, helping mentor students through my PhD has helped me connect with students in my current line of work. And so those are some things that I really want to bring up about the PhD experiences that are really valuable skill sets, no matter what PhDs decide to do after their training.
Yes, so true. I'd like to follow up on another point that you made, Sonali, I just view as vital, and that's the word perspective. You talked about how your work when setting up the IVF program, and then that was, of course, outside of academia. Then you went back into academia. You encountered, like everyone does, encountered challenges as part of your work. That's really part of the process, I expect. But you weren't overwhelmed by them, or you had a different maybe reaction to them because you had this deep professional, as you said, high stakes experience that gave you some perspective that helped you get through or overcome these challenges that you were facing once you returned to academia. Would you talk just a little bit about that? Because, of course, so many folks experience the pressures of the academic environment, and you're suggesting that the time that you took in between really helped you cope with some of that.
I think in the grand scheme of things, sometimes we compound the issues in our head so much, also because we are sort of cloistered into the academic environment and only talking to academics. Some of the challenges seem bigger than they are when we are in a PhD training. And so exposing ourselves to different perspectives, experiences before really grounds us to the significance of bigger problems. Not saying that our research problems are not big, but they're not the be all and end all of existence. And so a lot of the mental health issues that are cropping up are just some of the like really extenuating pressures we put on ourselves and our peers around us and the professional environment itself is, I think, due to lack of perspective. And in my case, just working with patients and seeing the application of my work and how it impacts patients' lives before I came into my PhD really helped me understand what is the stake here. So when I started my PhD, I was working on bacterial DNA invader systems and learning molecular mechanisms of that. For me, The yardstick was, can I stick something in a freezer that night and tackle it tomorrow? If it's not going to die, it can still be continued tomorrow. So it's a tomorrow's problem. And so that really helped me. Those were not some luxuries I could have when I was working in healthcare, because I could not tell a patient, no, we'll just delay your procedure. And so that was helpful for me to find that balance in my work and find the balance in expectations, whether it was self expectation or expectation from others.
Thank you for sharing that specific story. Sonali, we had a chance to talk offline about two of your professional passions, which are science communication and science policy. How did these strong interests develop, and what makes you so energized by them?
I started working on this field called CRISPR-Cas, which has now become a significant genome engineering tool and pretty much being used in vastly different areas of biology and medicine. But I started in the days in 2007 when practically nothing was known about these systems. And so I constantly found myself explaining it to people in my department, my peers, all the way to my parents in India. And so that already gave me the opportunity to think about different kinds of storytelling techniques to communicate the ideas behind how CRISPR works. And I tried simple, like sometimes oral storytelling, graphic storytelling, but it was more during the 3-minute thesis competition at University of Virginia when my advisors and I really spent a lot of time thinking about how best and most effectively to communicate the mechanism behind the CRISPR systems, and more broadly, the benefits of curiosity driven basic science to different problems in medicine and in biology. And when I was going through that, I realized that I was really excited by the process of 3MT. It can be pretty nerve wracking. Just to give a quick context, it's like explaining your research in 3 minutes
Mm.
or under 3 minutes. But I was excited by it. And so that's when my love for science communication more broadly started, where I could communicate my science to vastly different people. And I carried that love with me into my postdoc in Sloan Kettering Cancers, where I started the Science Outreach Committee of the Postdoc Association. And as part of that committee, one of my first initiatives was to collaborate with the New York Public Library to create series where scientists and postdocs from, especially from Rockefeller, Weill Cornell, and Sloan Kettering, could meet with library members and could have a dialogue on different diseases, where scientists could talk more about the scientific basis of some diseases, and our library members could really talk about the social implications of caregiving as well as some of the disparities that exist in healthcare. And with that exchange, there was like growth and development overall between, and there was building of trust between the members as well as the scientists in attendance. In terms of science policy, I learned a lot during my time in Sloan Kettering and at University of Virginia, and I continue to be fascinated by how that field is evolving, especially in the different facets in science diplomacy, the more I learn about it. And I think it's really important. We are at a time where science communication skills are existential, because scientists have to find creative ways of connecting with not just with the general public, but with policymakers in an age where misinformation and disinformation is so rampant. If we take the COVID pandemic as an example, that made one thing very clear, like the general public may not be entirely aware of the scientific process itself, because scientists were revising strategies as and when more available data was being available, which is inherent to the scientific process. But when you looked at it, a lot of people equated it to bad intent or cluelessness. And so we have a lot of work to even engage interest towards how science is done and engage people from all sections of society to think about how to gain that trust back in science and how to really encourage people to understand the nature of different kinds of problems. And through my own work in professional development, I do a little bit where I strive to create opportunities for budding scientists, especially graduate students, to gain the science communication skills and also engage in science policy conversations. And I'm pretty excited that the new scientists in training are increasingly interested in making science accessible, by effective science communication and science policy. So it's really validating to do this work.
You said so many things that lead to a number of different questions. The first thing I have to ask you, though, if you recall, is how did you end up describing CRISPR in your 3MT?
Took a lot of different, I think we stuck with the yogurt story, which was the origin of CRISPR.
Uh-huh.
CRISPR was identified by a group of scientists who worked in the yogurt industry. And it was because of big batches of yogurt were being spoiled by viruses, because the culture of yogurt is made by certain kinds of bacteria. And those bacteria also have viruses that kill them. But bacteria are smarter than humans. They've developed an immunity. They can recognize the DNA, or in the cases of viruses, RNAs of viruses, and store that information in themselves. And similar to immunity, the next time they're infected by the same virus, CRISPR is that system, which is almost like has a magnifying glass and a scissor that goes, identifies the virus and chops up its RNA into multiple pieces. And so how did we find that out, and how they are doing that in terms of identifying and chopping them up is what was the basis of my research.
Wonderful. Thank you for taking us through that. We touched upon this related to international students, of course, represent a significant portion of the population of graduate students in US universities, for example. But they're often ineligible for certain fellowships, as you know very well, including sometimes in science policy, which we, of course, just discussed. Can you share challenges that you have encountered, and perhaps to a degree you still encounter as an international PhD, and some ways you've handled it or overcome the challenges? I really think this could be so helpful for listeners who might find themselves in similar situations.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up this question. It's a real challenge in today's age. Like this nationally, going by the NSF data in 2018, almost 40 to 60% of STEM PhDs are international and in the United States. And however, there's like a barrier to entry for international PhD graduates in careers that are not focused primarily on research. For example, in science policy, a lot of the pathways that are provided through federal level fellowships are only restricted and available to US citizens. And so when I advise my students, I try to find, and in my own case, try to find other ways of doing this, other opportunities that might get you to the same destination, but through a different pathway. And so, for example, in science policy, I would tell my students to look at state level fellowships, academic opportunities, some of those in professional societies or even for-profit companies that look at science policy within their organization. And broadly speaking, now in the field of professional development, there's a national focus on encouraging career diversity of STEM PhDs and opening up PhDs more generously to society. But for international PhDs in the US, the immigration policies haven't kept up with the current trends of employment, and they still remain pretty restricted. So on my own case, making the transition from research to higher ed administration wasn't easy. My employers, especially at University of Virginia, I had to get really creative in making a strong case for the applicability of my PhD training beyond just RNA biology to secure visa sponsorship for doing the work that I was doing at UVA. We were able to do it, but it took us a lot of, let's just say we used our own PhD analytical thinking and problem solving skills to put my visa application together.
Good.
But we did it, so it can be done. But it's too complicated. And because it's so complicated, it's natural for employers to be risk averse. But through my own experience, I advise international students to play the numbers game. At the end, we need just one hiring manager to really advocate on our behalf. And so securing as many interviews and offers increases the likelihood. But that said, it's exhausting and it takes a lot of energy to be a job seeker as an international. And as someone in this field now, I've started building a community of practice of foreign-born practitioners of higher ed professional development. And we are trying to look at it like just be representatives of folks who are successful example and helping others who want to get into career paths like ours. But at the same time, also take approaches of employer education on ways to get creative in the current system as it exists. But ultimately, I really hope the scenario changes in the future because I believe strongly that international PhDs are assets to every professional sector. And unfortunately, in the absence of a future oriented immigration system, international PhDs are already and will increasingly start looking at global employment opportunities that gives them more flexibility.
So important. A couple of things that you mentioned, Sonali, that I'd also like to highlight is the situation we're in with respect to science communication and the general lack of the public's understanding related to how the scientific enterprise works and expecting consistency. And when finding inconsistent information, viewing that as somehow cluelessness, as you put it, which is so true, not really explaining sort of expectations management at the front end, saying things change. This is a brand new virus. We're not familiar with it. And people reverting back to a natural human reflex to want consistency. And then also tying what you said about more exposure of PhDs to the broader workforce, meaning just other elements of the public that they have not necessarily been historically interacting with, I think can help a lot with this misinformation question because it builds this kind of trust and familiarity that you referenced too. So thank you for underlining that because I really do think that's one of the roots of this whole thing is the trust issue across sectors, not obviously related to scientists. I want to talk about the latest transition that you've made to the Grad Futures team at Princeton. As mentioned in the intro, you recently started in your new role as Assistant Dean for Professional Development. And even at this early point in time there, what can you share with listeners about Grad Futures and perhaps some of its programming that listeners could experience or participate in?
Yeah, Grad Futures at Princeton is campus wide professional development initiative with the goal of empowering graduate students with professional competencies and connections to succeed and thrive in graduate school, as well as have the agency to chart their professional future with clarity and confidence. To implement this goal, we rely on a strategic framework, which includes exposure to diverse professional pathways, emerging fields, and progressive learning of skills and competencies, building connections with alumni, mentors, leaders in different fields, and also having access to immersive experiences like fellowships. We offer a variety of programs for mostly for students in Princeton, includes learning cohorts to build distinct skills, access to alumni mentorship program, and experiential fellowship programs. However, there are certain programs and opportunities that are open and accessible to everyone outside Princeton as well. I'll give two examples. One is the annual Grad Futures Forum, which is a week long professional development symposium that typically takes place in the spring. It's open and accessible to anyone outside of Princeton. Listeners can participate in the symposium in real time or watch the recorded sessions with multiple like influential professionals, PhD professionals on the Grad Futures YouTube channel. And the second example is Grad Futures recently launched a podcast which centers the future of PhDs by telling professional stories of graduate students, alumni, and partners. And listeners can download those on most of the podcasting platforms like Spotify, Apple, Google, Audible, or Pocket Cast.
Wonderful. We'll definitely have a link to how to do that in the show notes so that listeners can find these resources. And you've included so many valuable resources in your response to this part of this conversation. And I want to, as we wrap up, ask you to just looking at the horizon and thinking about the future. Clearly, the pandemic has upended our world in so many respects, and it's fundamentally disrupted industries and institutions including academia, of course. And when you think about the future, how do you see academic training at your level adjusting to new norms around work, for example? And how can grad students, PhDs, trainees best position themselves, do you think, for success in this brave new world, so to speak?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question. I like to think that some of these conversations and discussions on improving the academic training environment and reforming it in some ways were already underway, but the pandemic expedited the urgency for not just rethinking, but like implementing and practicing some of the changes. The immediate one that comes to mind is digital transformation, right? Leveraging technologies in the ways that we work, whether it's hybrid workforce, remote working, or teaching online. I don't think all of it is going to go away. Like we have adapted ways and we've scaled it up so that a lot of lecturers and professors will continue to have part of their curriculum online and possibly adapt flipped classroom models when they hadn't done it before. The other thing that has opened up is wide access to collaborations online with the world felt a lot closer. People working on Zoom. And I really hope that continues to happen. For the future of academic training, I think collaboration is the name of the game. And that's talking about collaboration across sectors, like having university industry partnerships, having university nonprofit partnerships. And what it also does, it diversifies funding streams. The most scientists have predominantly relied on federal funding for their research. But more and more, we are seeing that there's been a diversification of funding stream that's also coming from institutional funds within the universities, but also outside from diverse sectors, for profit, nonprofit, what have you. And so that's also going to be really important for collaboration. And talking about collaboration, like one of the ways that it used to be in some ways restricted was conferences and who had the ability to travel places. But now in the last 2 years, we've tested out what forms and fashions of online conferences can work out. And I think in the future, we might still see hybrid conferences happening. And one of the things that, like the last thing that I would say is, which is again, goes back to the point of building trust, is community engagement and really co-creating some of the ways to solve complex problems like climate change with communities that are impacted by it. And so hopefully the way that we do approach scholarship and research can also more intentionally include communities that are impacted by it and also share authorship and ownership of that work with the communities. I like to take an optimistic point about how PhDs and trainees best can position themselves for this in the future. There is one good thing about having no rules. And it's that PhDs are pretty much made for this moment of constant change, because through our training, we learn constantly to keep learning, keep problem solving, having a growth mindset, having comfort with unpredictability and unfamiliarity, all of that in our research. What we need to do is to apply that to our lives, to be willing to move non-linearly, to keep an eye on both macro as well as micro trends, and be willing to constantly learn and upskill to position ourselves in multiple diverse professions. And what we need to really instill and focus on is the confidence that we should have in our ability, as well as applicability of the PhD training. Because I, again, want to emphasize that at the end of the day, the training process of the PhD is the real asset. And we should take more of that into account in addition to our domain knowledge and expertise that we develop. Because the process of PhD really does equip one with more durable human skills like communication, problem solving, collaboration, project management, data storytelling, what have you. These skills are actually going to be more durable than a lot of the technical skills that we develop through our domain expertise, which will tend to have a shorter or rapid turnover time due to technological advancement and constant change in the future of work. So if we can build confidence and effectively communicate the more durable skills and abilities that we bring, and our ability to flexibly change and adapt with change, that should situate us in really a good way in the brave new world. And finally, I'd like to say that every sector of society right now needs more critical thinkers. And PhDs are those people. We think critically as a way of life. And so we need to be more generously engaging with diverse problems and challenges in society and bring our thought process more openly to these problems.
And those will be the last words of the episode. Dr. Sonali Majumdar, such an uplifting, energizing, hopeful, valuable, insightful conversation with you. Just enjoyed it so much. And I know our listeners are going to feel the same way.
Thank you.
And listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.